Good evening, everyone, and good afternoon to our guests, Fiona and Sean, who are joining us from the UK. And all of us have got together to celebrate a very, very beautiful book this evening. This is Fiona Sampson's The School on the Coast Road, which contains new and selected poems from her work of around 2 decades. And what a lovely book this has turned out to be. For those of us who are already acquainted with it, who have already had the opportunity of admiring these gorgeous poems and the gorgeous cover in which it appears, we are very, very grateful to have such a special book out in the world. And the poems, of course, speak for themselves, for the kind of light that Fiona is scattering through them. We are very happy to be here to discuss this wonderful book and to have some readings from it. So I would like to begin the session by introducing first Sean, who will introduce Fiona and her work to our audience. And of course, Sean does not need any introduction. He is too well known to require an introduction. And yet, just a word. So Sean O'Brien is a leading British poet, critic, novelist, short fiction writer, and professor of creative writing at Newcastle University, England. He has been a fellow of the UK's Royal Society of Literature, is 3 times winner of the Forward Prize for Poetry, and the winner of the 2007 T.S. Eliot Poetry Prize. Sean, we are very grateful that you could make it with us for this session, and over to you for your thoughts on Fiona's book.
Well, I'm very honoured to be asked and delighted to be able to say just a little about Fiona's selected poems. Well, I've known Fiona's poetry for 15 years, perhaps now, perhaps a little longer, and I've always thought its development has been exciting and somehow steady and cumulative. I suppose if I were to try and place the kind of poems that Fiona writes, I would say that they are, in a sense, dramatic lyrics. You know, that they have the power of feeling that we expect from lyric poetry, but also the sense of event taking place in the poem that I would term dramatic. So I think they're dramatic lyrics. The subject matter is very wide, but perhaps the most characteristic mode of the work is contemplative. In a landscape, in a time of day, in the dark, at a moment of transition, for example. And also the thing which continues to impress me, and this is particularly true of the new poems, is that gradually it seems to me that Fiona has removed all the scaffolding, all the extraneous structural assistance from the poems in order to arrive at the actual poem itself in its relatively unmediated state. And I could see this in a poem from her collection Cole's Hill, which it's called Orphic, Orphic. So it has to do with Orpheus and Orpheus's lute, harps, the underworld, and so on. But it's actually looking at a dead vixen, a female fox, by the side of the road, and the poem seems to itself to be animated by the sight of the thrown back jaw of the dead she-fox, which then, within a dozen, 15 lines, has suddenly taken on a kind of mythical presence. And it is very difficult to say. Well, it would be a fool who asked, is this poem happy or sad? It just is. It's about the imagination discovering something and in turn being discovered by it. The other thing that interests me, I have a long list of these things, but I won't go on forever. The other thing that interests me is the way in which the reader is always drawn into the poem's world. You know, he's always offered a seat at the table of whatever is going on. And it seems to me that at the same time as becoming more and more economical and more purely musical all the time, that what Fiona Sampson is doing, and she might not thank me for saying this, is writing the kind of poems now that philosophers might write if philosophers were able to write poetry, which, generally speaking, they're not. There's a sense of being in the presence of the world, of being part of the world's presence. And I suppose you might say that was slightly Heideggerian without all the political clutter that goes with that. A sense of simply being here, and in some weird way that being sufficient. Among the new poems, there are half a dozen at the front of the book. There's one called The Days, which I think is very fine, which is, it allows itself to even doubt its own activity as it goes on. It incorporates, doubts and uncertainties into the poem, which is what, of course, we know Keats was interested in doing, of allowing the unfinished, the emergent, to have a place in the poem. But then there's also the beautifully statuesque poem, Demijohn Vase, which is about how an object seems to refuse to be enlisted in the cause of anything else, merely to be there as a sort of presiding presence under the contemplation of the poet stroke viewer. And again, it's beautifully, I would say it was sculpted, except that it moves, which is not characteristic of sculpture as we know, that there's a sense, the Chinese jar moves in its stillness, as Eliot once put it. And these are some of the reasons why I greatly admire Fiona's poetry, because she's going beyond the often rather parochial and distracted condition of a lot of poetry in the UK. She's doesn't claim that subject matter is the only thing that matters. She doesn't claim that autobiography trumps everything else. She just writes what the imagination presents to her and makes memorable, as it were, animated objects out of it. And it's great that her work is being made available to readers in India. And I commend her work to you very wholeheartedly. And I'm very grateful to Red River Press for doing this book. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sean. That was a brilliant introduction to Fiona's work. And I think I thank you for mentioning the word philosophy. You're very right when you say that these are poems that a philosopher would write if they could write poetry. And I think I was just telling Fiona at the start of the session that I have been totally mesmerized by the kind of language that she uses. And when I tried to do some research on her, I found that she had a PhD on the philosophy of language. So I was telling her that makes you a kind of sorceress. You know how to woo words and you know how to make them yield their secrets to you. So thank you. You, in a way, reaffirm what I had been thinking about these poems. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
And from...
Before we move on, can I say how enormously grateful I am? I feel like I've been read for the first time, Sean. That's exactly what I've been trying to do. I mean, what could be more blissful than someone to mirror back that what you're trying to do has arrived, particularly given it's you with your absolutely centered critical intelligence. Your I don't mean it's divinatory, nothing as pretentious as that. I just mean you are very, very good at reading poems and poets, and so gosh, I couldn't. Yeah, I'm really, really moved. Thank you. And of course, Heidegger was indeed the subject of my PhD, though, as you say, without the political nonsense. So,
Great.
Yes, I think it is wonderful. It's a very special feeling to be read as intended. And I can understand what Fiona must be feeling at the moment. And we have more ideas to be discussed about the book. And to carry on the discussion further, we have with us Tuhin Bhowal. Tuhin is the recipient of the Dipankar Khewani Memorial Prize 2022. His poems and translations have appeared in several journals, are forthcoming in many, like Poetry at Sangam, Bad Dillies, the Oxford Anthology of Translation, the Adda, the Commonwealth Writers UK magazine. He lives in Bangalore and he has been very, very kind to join us from there. And to talk about Fiona's books, Tuhin, I would like to invite you. Over to you.
Yeah, is my audio okay?
Yes, perfect, perfect.
Yeah. So I am not joining for Bangalore, so I am at home in a small town in West Bengal, and I think, thank God that philosophers don't write poetry, or at least not the good ones, right? Yeah. It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks, Odibba, for asking me. Sean, I'm really jealous of your, book stack in the background, even Fiona's, right? Yeah. So it is through Red River that I first encountered Fiona's work. And one of the poems that Sean mentioned, the days, in the first section of the book, which has some of her new poems, right? I am kind of pissed and tired of people reviewing whole books together all together. I really don't believe in that kind of a generalized kind of vision, right? Especially when it comes to poems. So what I would do is I would like to take a few minutes to discuss the days, and this is what I generally try to do: close read a few poems. And I was going through the poem, the days, and was focusing on this poem. And there's this another poem called The Years, uh, by the US poet Alex Dimitrov. And it was interesting to, kind of study and uh, think about both poems and both narrators together, because once there's the years and the days, it also kind of allowed and invoked me to kind of uh, think about the theme that Jack Gilbert used to talk about in his poems about containment and spillage, right? So, I mean, can I share my screen with the other poems? Yes, because I think we'll
Yes,
read
of
Fiona's
course, of
poems later.
course. Perfect.
Okay, I'll try to share my screen, Vasudhara. If I'm not able to, I think,
No, you will be
uh,
able to. You should be.
okay, is the screen up?
It's coming.
Yes.
There, I think. Yeah, can you see the poem?
Yeah,
Yeah, so it's called The Years by Alex Dimitrov.
from the New
All the
Yorker.
parties you spent watching the room from a balcony where someone joined you to smoke, then returned. And how it turns out no one had the childhood they wanted. And how they tell you this a little drunk, a little slant, in less time than it took to finish a cigarette. Because sad things can't be explained. Behind the glass and inside, all your friends buzzed. You could feel the shape of their voices. You could tell from their eyes they were in some other place, 1999 or 2008 or last June. Of course, it's important to go to parties, to make life a dress or a drink or suede shoes someone wears in the rain. On the way home, in the car back, the night sky played its old tricks. The stars arranged themselves quietly. The person you thought of drove under them, away from the party, just like you, into the years. And this is The Days by Fiona herself. Today a fog lay all day on the white water, shine and stop, song, mute. I can't see even by clear water whether I should act or is the grace in submission. Should I watch or let the light fall into fog? My duty was to clean the lens, but revelation is so loud. It is not altogether clear to me. It is not clear at all. what I should do at the river.
Hmm.
Yeah, I will stop sharing now. Yeah, I think I mean what Sean said, right? A lot of Fiona is doing away from a lot of what Mary Ruffle says. You chop away everything from the poem if something remains that is the poem, right? And we see a lot of lack of punctuation. You know, in the vision of, let's say, Mervyn, there's this lack of punctuation. You can read a phrase. If I read it, I can pause at a different juncture in the poem. If someone else read it, they can pause at a different junction in the poem. That adds to a lot of silences, a lot of nuances there as well. There's a big space somewhere in the middle of it, right? And you wonder what's there or what's not there, what's slipping away, what is spilling away. And yeah, so I think focus and also the lack of focus is important, like clarity and the lack of clarity. And someone who has wore specs from the age of 5, it was interesting. I mean, the narrator, he mentions, I can't see even by clear water. That's kind of oxymoronic, right? He says, I can't, he or she or they, I'm sorry, I can't see. And then they mention it is clear water, right? Uh, uh, these are some of the interesting things which I kind of was drawn to. And in the whole context, the whole setting of the poem, some of the words they kind of feel off, they kind of stand out. Like grace is a heavy word. Submission in itself has a lot of sexual connotation. Duty, duty is a really heavy word, right? Uh, then there is revelation. Uh, so yeah, by the end of it, it the poem kind of does so much with so little, right? And these were the things that I also thought about a little bit of color and texture of the poem. I think it was similar to the Years by Dimitrov. It just feels like a rainy night. It feels like a foggy afternoon, a foggy evening, cold. Uh, so yeah, these were the kind of things which I was interested, and to observe and read a poem like The Days after the kind of huge work that Fiona has done, chopping away almost with everything, language itself, that was interesting, and that held me more than any of the other poems or some of the other poems from early collections. So yeah, I just wanted to talk about this one poem rather than pretending to sound intelligent and talking other things. So yeah. So yeah, that's pretty much it.
Thank you.
Thank you, Tuhin. Yes, Fiona, would you like to thank him personally?
Well, thank you very much. Yes, thank you, Tuhin. That's very interesting and surprising and different reading. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, really, really interesting to hear. Also, really interesting to hear you read it.
Yes, that is something which I find very interesting about poetry, because when it flows through another voice and when it flows through, it's not just voice, it's also the reader's consciousness. So it takes a different shape, very different from the intended shape, in the author's mind. So I think the shape of a poem is very collaborative. The shape that I construct in my mind and the shape that it acquires, in which ways I say that a poem is like water. So it takes the shape of the container into which it flows. Thank you, Tuhin. Thank you for your observations on Fiona's poems, especially for the close reading of Days, which indeed stands out in the collection. But then I think there are many, many poems and segments from it which catch my attention. So I think that from this discussion, it would be worthwhile to move on to the author herself. So though we talk about the death of the author, I feel that we cannot totally dispense with the author when it comes to the act of creation, because somewhere, we need the author to talk about the process of creation. Just critics deconstructing a piece of work and trying to read against the grain would not take us to the locus from where the work stems. And probably all creation stems from one common source that we're trying to identify. And Fiona identifies it as light, as prayer, as revelation. The few poems that I have read from the collection, I mean, I have read a lot, but I would say that I have been able to absorb few of them because they take time. They demand slow, patient reading. And the few poems that I have read, and I have tried to read them randomly, choosing poems from her earliest collections and reading poems from her, latest work. And I find that certain things have remained the same. So Fiona is repeatedly, and something that Sean also pointed out, she's repeatedly trying to accomplish a kind of conjoinment between the ordinary and the mythical. So there is this flow of time in her poems, I would say, the epiphany or the turning point in the poem, the line around which the poem turns, is mostly in every poem a line that conjoins the mundane to the mythic. So this is, I think, that's something that has remained throughout her entire work. And the second thing that I have noticed, something very common to all the poems, is something related to form that Tuhin also happened to mention. I would say there's a surgical precision to Fiona's poems. If you read them in, ascending order, beginning from the earliest collection and so in the descending order of the book, that is, you find that there's a very surgical precision. So it's like, it's like a scalpel, a surgeon using a scalpel, and you just take out what you need. There is, the language is very precise, but it is very emotive, very dense, when you look at it that way. And these things must not have been easy to conjure. So Fiona, we are very glad you're here with us, and we would love to hear about your poetic journey, your journey with poetry, and what led to the School on the Coast Road. And also if you could throw some light on why you titled this collection, The School on the Coast Road. So the title poem, it has some kind of spiritual relevance inside the collection and inside the poet's mind and the poetic universe, So what kind of relevance does The School on the Coast Road hold for you? Over to you. And
Thank you
yes,
very much.
I'm so sorry I never introduced Fiona, though of course she again needs the introduction, but yes, as a formal note for everyone who will be viewing this video down the lines, a few short lines for Fiona. So Fiona is a leading British poet and writer. She has been published in 38 languages and has published 29 books already. National honors include an MBE for literature, the Newdigate, and numerous other prizes that she has received. So she has worked in search, she has her internationally acclaimed In Search of Mary Shelley, is followed by Two-Way Mirror, the life of Elizabeth Barrett Browning, incidentally two of my very, very favorite writers, which already makes Fiona very close to my heart. So Fiona, over to you for your discussion.
Thank you so much, Ambassador. And thank you so much to everybody, including Dibia, for this absolutely beautiful book. Every new book is a thrill, but this book is a particular thrill because I have this sense of loving the idea of participating a tiny bit in, Indian poetic culture, which seems to me very rich and beautiful, and something with which I feel kind of instinctively a little bit of affinity to. That might be cheeky of me, but I do. But also because this is such an incredibly well-designed, scrupulously done book. I mean, it's just the whole thing's been a huge pleasure and a privilege. And one has to be polite and say that, but in this case, it's really genuinely true. And I'm also enormously kind of warmed by the generosity of everybody who's on this call in taking the time out of your busy evenings and afternoons to talk about the book. Thank you hugely. As Sean was saying, I've always been slightly out of step, I think, with British poetry fashion. And so there is the silence in the centre of the poems is probably the silence of the reader. There's a slight sense of never believe when I'm trying to write poetry that I'm talking to myself. I think I don't think writing is. I think it's talking to, you know, the ideal reader. But there is certainly a sort of loneliness or kind of literary isolation around my poetry, which is not the case around my prose. And also embedded in it, particularly in the early collections, are the traces of an internationalism, which means that I've been very interested in translation and co-translation, done lots of work in that area, as indeed has Sean. And that's been very influential for me, because one of the things that happens when you are involved in literary translation isn't it? And I know Tuhin is involved in literary translation too, this sense of distillation, a sense of the original poem must have good bones, and then a kind of, well, purity in your relationship to, as the host translator, to the original text, but also sense of a kind of, again, I'm saying the same words, distillation, purity around the primary text in source language, that kind of sense that you move it beyond its context or its well-knownness or whatever, and beyond the technical problems that the first poet had to solve, as you try and resolve those problems in the new language. And it also means that have done a lot of reading of poetry in translation, which has undergone this process of distillation. And poetry in translation in Britain, it became very fashionable in a sense in the 90s. And there was a lot of poetry that, whatever the form of the source language, was translated into free verse. And that was a real kind of call to poetics for me. I mean, actually, I started writing poetry because I read Cavafy in translation, because the Alexandria Quartet was a hugely important book for me when I gave up the violin. And Lawrence Stone talks a lot. It's a very problematic book, I now realize, Orientalist and so on, although in a way anti-Orientalist, because it mocks, in a sense, the Westerners who just don't understand what's going on. But Lawrence Darling, it talks over and over about Cavafy, the Greek, the wise Greek. So I went out and bought my first book of 20th century poetry, which was Cavafy, and in the Keeley translations, which are beautiful. And there's a kind of limpid quality that I'm always searching for in poetry. And I am a huge fan of Merwin's, and Merwin was very kind about my poetry, and I have never tried to imitate him. But when I read Merwin's sort of statement in the 70s, that, you know, the notion that poetry's a punctuation staples a poem to the page, I thought, aha, because I'm very interested in breath and the kind of connected life of a poem. So for the last sort of 3 books, the new poems, Come Down and The Catch, going backwards, they are all accentual verse. So they are strict numbers of feet per line, but the feet aren't in regular meters. So it's not I ams, for example. Because just as with syllabics, I think that provides a sort of secret coherence and weighty, and a balancing of weight and a necessity, which I don't quite always find in free verse, although I read loads of free verse and have written loads of free verse. And it allows a concentration, which comes back to the distillation, that sense that I'm trying from all sides to get to this kind of, well, you talked about water, Basadara, that kind of sense of something poured through the poem. And because I used to be a professional musician, I do think of the poem on the page as scored. It is like a musical score. This is the map of the sound. I think that whether I'm reading, you know, Sean's poems, which are often in pentameter, okay, I know Sean's work really quite well, and I can hear his reading voice. He has a very, very charismatic reading voice, but I can hear that. And there are poets like, for example, Les Murray, whom I admired but could not fall in love with till I heard him read, and then I heard his Australian accent inhabit his lines, and I could manage them. But my voice is much more, well, obviously it's not in that league, but also my voice is very short-lined because I don't have a lot of breath. I've always been bronchial asthmatic. I'm someone who I can't say a 5-stress line without taking a breath, and therefore I don't think in 5-stress lines. I think with qualifications and phrases, and that voice, although I don't particularly like hearing my voice back, as nobody does, but that voice is the voice that I'm scoring on the page. And not because I think it's wonderful, but more in a kind of modest sense of the oral tradition, that you kind of, there's a sense always of passing forward. And it's taken me a really, really long time to get to a kind of poetics that I felt comfortable with, but I've always been reinventing and trying to find it. So the poems that I preserve from my first book are the syllabic sonnets, because I've always been interested in form as a way to do it. But I think because I was trained as a classical violinist, where the music is a given rather than improvised, so there's a sense of the givenness of the intention almost prior to the work. So there's a sense of the givenness of form almost prior to I want it to be this kind of poem. And it's taken me a long time to think, no, I am the composer. I am inside the poem. I am leading the poem. So, you know, they are syllabic sonnets, the sonnets I preserve for my first book, and they are 14 syllables to a line, and they're all one sentence. But it's a very different impulse from the all one sentence poems that I write now, which are much closer to E.M. Forster and only connect. And I can hear myself going on too long. So I'll just say that in the middle, I try to find another way to kind of have the poem carry itself. So I used step lines and long lines and scored very closely what I could hear in my head. But, and rather irritatingly, that is now rather fashionable in the Anglophone world, but it wasn't when I was doing it. And it was a sense of what is she doing here? What are all these floating lines? And, you know, my huge thanks to Dibia, because typographically often they came out mangled, you know, or, you know, the stepped line, the line that was kind of a kind of call and response, as it were, with a caesura, would be shoved back to the margin. No, that's not how the poem goes. So I don't mean, oh, I'm content now, but I mean, I've been now working in the form I'm working in for this, the book I'm, you know, working on now, the manuscript I'm working on now. That'll be my third book in accentual verse, and it seems still to be, I don't feel yet I'm repeating myself, and it still feels live to me. That was a bit long, wasn't it? Should I read a poem or
Yes, it was not at all long, and we are just enjoying you speak, and we would also like you to go ahead and read some of your favorite poems from the collection.
Thank you. Thank you, Sean, for mentioning Orphic, which is a poem I really like. You know how in a collection you have a poem which is like a pivot poem to the next book or the next book, and I just really, yeah, I mean, I don't want to be Hughesian, but I've written a lot of poems about, well, train poems, but also car traveling at night poems, because I've done a lot of commuting in my life. And yeah, that was one. It's not actually a This Really Happened one. It's a sort of composite one. I'll start with Dante's Cave, which is in The Catch. This is in a way, it's a translation poem, because it's from Slovenia. I've been to some poetry festivals in Slovenia, and I have a poet friend there who thinks that everything starts in Slovenia. Everything was invented in Slovenia, including Dante's Divine Comedy. He thinks that Dante in exile made his way to Slovenia in the karst region, came across the World Heritage Caves at Scotland, and that's what inspired him. Of course, we know the Divine Comedy is a great work of revenge literature, but so this is Dante's Cave, Velika Dolina, Scotland. Finally, I came to the end of the world, to a limestone cliff falling in pale steps, and far below a pool, somehow out of myth, proving that there was nothing but the rock to hold me up, to raise me into that clear air where crows were looping, where the eye of God was gold and inattentive. Then I saw the end is air and falling. It is clean and lovely. It is blue. I have a lot of Christian symbolism in my poetry, and I'm not Christian, but I'm post-Christian because I was brought up very religious, and that vocabulary of the King James Bible, Book of Common Prayer, it was quotidian in my childhood, and it's really important to me. And in fact, I'm going to read Lady of the Sea. This is also a place poem. This is a Rocamadour poem where there's a black Madonna. She's black because she's silvered, and the silver is medieval, so it's tarnished and gone black. and she is. There are lots of votives. It's a votive chapel really for sailors who've survived shipwreck or are afraid of shipwreck. Stella Maris, really. Lady of the Sea. Blue and black, the Virgin sits in her high palanquin. She does not regard us. Her regard is drawn back from us, far back among the centuries, where she comes from and where she is going. Already she is travelling past us and away, ancient star, flying so slowly we do not see her move. Suppose she, compassionate, uncoiled her serpent's arms, or let that black mask fall. Could she move among us then? Or what would be broken and fired again? What understanding newly perfected? High and far, very high and far, like the disappearing note of wind shrilling between glass, comes the tone the sweet stone rings when you knock the saint's open sarcophagus. Lady, in your ark of stone, you who wear the white stone as a wedding gown, lady adamant and personal, we carry you in the eyes reliquary like a moat or like a beam that drowning we could cling to. Lady, stronger than time, stronger than light, we see you invisible and everywhere. I guess I should read an earlier one, shouldn't I?
Please do. Yes.
I'll read you a driving one. It's funny reading old poems because I haven't read them for a long time. So I used to commute to and from London. I often was getting the late train after a literary event in the evening and then driving across the Vale of the White Horse, which is in Oxfordshire. Night Fugue. Gathering leftover light, a barn owl turns, pinkish wings oaring strongly up, then lower. Turning at the end of each disciplined row, displays his wide human face, then, on a twist, sinks in a heart-shaped plunge of white, splayed feathers, carrying light, carrying the eye into long, pale grass. He lifts again, almost backward onto dim currents, the perfect chime of balance in his wingspan, where light concentrates, a barium glow, as if feathers are a print of something hidden. The body like music, form opening through time in a breathing line, a cry. On the car radio, bell-like notes of John Cage hang as if there were no break between you and this strangely inexact nightfall. Between each hair trembling on the leveret's back, each compacted bud and the hum of your consciousness. Think of chimes falling on an anvil of air that clangs back, upward, each bell stroke returned to the echo roof. The wide veil suspended between breaths, between strike and release. Mile after mile of smudged black. Think of yourself, rapt velocity, tearing through the pulpy core of a spring night as if toward an opening, as if making a place through which to close on where you are not. Like a pane of deeper dark in darkness, something like that deepening of voice when everything's seen between you and it, and hundreds of small, warm creatures intent on this moment. They go intently through you, towards daylight. Gosh, it's very nice to read that poem again after such a long time and remember driving across the Vale and So it's that rare thing, that thing we all tell our students not to do, that really happened poem.
Thank you. Thank you. Those were very, very lovely poems and very beautifully read. And that reminded me that I wanted to tell you that I love the enjambment in your poetry. You know, I love how the lines break. It's like there's a little violence to each line, you know, the way you shell a peanut, there's a cracking, there's a splintering, and that splintering leads you to the harmony of the next line. This alternative, you know, especially the second last poem that you read, where like, there's the line breaks on like, and that gives a kind of energy, which I think adds to the charm of the poem. So I love that splintering, you know, at the end of each line. It's a new kind of rhythm. I wanted to tell you that. Thank you so much for reading out that particular piece.
Thank you so
And
much,
now-
Master. And what a wonderful phrase, there's a little violence in every line. I really want to steal that. That's a wonderful phrase.
And from Fiona's poems and Fiona's voice, we move on to Fiona's poems and the voice of two other poets whom we celebrated last month. Both of them have had their new collections out from Red River, Smitha and Tansy. Tansy must be very happy. She's on a train, and there have been many poems read out on trains and discussion on trains simply because of you. Thank you, Tansy, for bringing in the space of the train into this session. So we begin the session by inviting Smitha, who, of course, just told us that she has been an admirer of Fiona for long. So Smitha Sehgal is a legal professional from Calicut, the seaside city of Malabar. Also, incidentally, which reminds us of Kamala Das each time I read out her bio. And Smitha has resumed writing after 25 years. Her poems have been widely featured in contemporary literary publications such as Ink, Sweat and Tears, Tiger Moth Review, Almost Island. Through her poems, she seeks to give voice to women and restore their dignity beyond the statutes. Her recent collection of poems, How Women Become Poems in Malabar, has just been out, and she has also this year been nominated as Best of the Net by 3 prestigious journals. Thank you very much, Smitha, for being with us and for reading Fiona's poems. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Basudhara, for inviting me here, and such a pleasure to be here in the company of Sean and Fiona, Tuhin, Tansy. Well, I can't contain my excitement, so I'll have to show off my treasures first. Yes, this is another book which I greatly admire. Starlight Wood. Yes. So I've been quietly following Fiona's poems for almost a decade now. Indian mythology has the story of this boy, Ekalavya, who does not belong to the Kshatriya clan, the clan of the kings and princes, etc. And he wants to learn archery. So he is quietly watching this group of boys being taught archery by the very eminent and accomplished teacher of archery. So I've been that student who, has been quietly watching this poetry scene, learning from, masters like Fiona. And Fiona, I must confess that I've been listening to your poems in your voice, and today it's very special for me to hear it live. So I will read 2 poems here. The energy of the poems, this poem, Blood Lyrics. It's troublingly dark with a startling range of emotions. And there's a profound joy in her poems. And as Basudhara said, that the cracking of the peanut and the finding the way, the curve, the enjambment, that limpid quality, that's there in her poems. So I'll read the poem, Blood Lyrics. They set our table under a tree. I saw your hunger and was ashamed. Covered myself with words and silence to break the line from your mouth to mine. Exile blackens your tongue with knowledge. Your black pupils are ravenous for my hunger. Every morning in the oven of your mouth, you burn and raise me daily bread. I taste of ashes. Eat me. When you put your hands around my neck, I didn't know whether I was great or small. My bones flew out into the universe and began to sing, a scatter of small birds. Did you kill me or love me? Night rises from the earth, always the same night with its claws at my stomach. What a beautiful poem. Intuitive sense of balance and reflecting the self in an utter state of joy. The second poem which I would read is The Corn Vesicles. When I read this poem, I couldn't but help wonder, Fiona, whether this poem was born from one of those 10 walks, which, yes,
It's early, actually, Smitha, but I do, I do love walking it. So it was I didn't go out with my family, and I walked with my brother when I'd newly met him. He's 4 years younger than me. Through a path cut through corn, through a cornfield in the Cotswolds. Yeah. And it's a way to address him without addressing him.
Oh, so I'll read the poem because it looks like a personal reflection. I love paths cut through corn, through grass and meadow sweet. That clean opening, as if the path were a pattern for life, abstract and true, as if form were a truth about you. And I love to walk the new swath, where stalks start up from the exact goal dark. As I reach down to touch each corn head with a fingertip, it makes me think of Helena, Empress, mother of Constantine, gambling on the natural justice that gods reward faithfulness. Everything good still waits in the next field. The best is yet to come. And it smells of warm earth, crazed by the sun, of seed heads husked against my thumb. Do you remember when we walked at Eastleach? Did you see me stoop and grow strange to myself, like the rows of wheat, like shaking bells of husk? Fiona, before I move to the next poem, I'd like to hear from you anything you would like to say about Blood Lyrics, the poem Blood Lyrics.
Thank you, Smitha. It's really interesting you've picked both of these poems so far because they're both interpersonal poems, fairly obviously. So listening to you read Corn Versicles, makes me feel sad because I'm not in touch with my brother again. So that kind of optimism didn't really... there was no faithfulness. The gods did not reward faithfulness in a way. But Blood Lyrics is... I'm glad you think it's joyful because, it's obviously a sex poem and it's quite an ambivalent poem because it's a long ago relationship now with a poet from another country. And it was fairly stormy, let's say. And I think we were both very good and very bad for each other. So, I think he wasn't thrilled by that poem either. Because, no, I think he was actually. I think he did like it. He did translate it. So,
thank you. I think we all go through those pieces. And the next poem, which I'd like to read is. I'll read only a part of this poem because I'm not so sure that we are running short of time because there's Tansy also. Attitudes of Prayer. Now, interestingly, there's a little note. After Ludwig van Beethoven, Quartet in C minor, 131. Fiona,
yes.
Any significance to the title?
Well, it was a commission to write about music. It was a commission for Radio 3 for the Verb. I don't think they were expecting this. And it's very difficult to write about the late Beethoven quartets because of Eliot. And because for me, the four quartets are the poem in the English language. It's not fashionable, you're supposed to think The Wasteland or whatever, but for me, it's the quartets. And for me, also in music, probably, it's the late Beethoven quartets. I mean, they seem to me, well, they are approaches to God, you know, they are, Eliot said about the late Beethoven, heavenly and more than human joy. But I think that there was a tremendous sense of struggle. It's a very Protestant reading, but that sense of struggling towards meaning or struggling towards the divinity, but not being good enough. And that's obviously also, there's a very analogous struggle when you're trying to make something. And Beethoven clearly did make something, but I think that you can hear the struggle. You can hear that he's stretching the form, he's stretching tonality in terms of chromaticism, he's stretching fugue form, he's stretching what a string quartet can do, and he's stretching as a set of instruments, he's also stretching the sonata form, the string quartet, that string quartets were in the classical era were written in, you know, exposition, development, recapitulation. So it's all stretched and strained as far as it can possibly be. And that seems to me like prayer. So
yeah, thank you. That's yeah. The poem reads, 131 approaches to the problem of God. Imagine it, over and over, rehearsing what you don't know, soundlessly. I'll read this. I'm quite fascinated by this, so I'll read this stanza once again. 131 approaches to the problem of God. Imagine it, over and over, rehearsing what you don't know, soundlessly. Letting yourself transcribe what no one has said before, in your greatcoat, in the freezing study where you take bitter tobacco and coffee. Occasionally, through the pall of tinnitus, hearing what? I feel as if heaven lay close upon the earth, and I between them both, breathing through the eye of a needle. Early December, grey on grey, grey annealing grey, except light, catching the high notes of a fiddle. Quick, quick, said the bird, your breath like smoke on the window. That's the extract I'd like to read because Basudhara, unless we have time, because it's a long poem.
Yes, you can read the extract.
Yeah, thank you. Light glints on a door handle, draws parallels on the carpet. When you were a child, those voices in another room seemed far off. Under the covers, in darkness, you drew your knees up to your chin. Lamplight on skin on a polished table. Laughter lit up your mother's voice. It made you think of honey, slipped away like the muntjac you see sometimes browsing beyond the service station. Half dog, half deer, caught on pause before neutral pathways catch and it flickers off, like something you can almost taste but are afraid to. Light against dark. The way you remember Nazareth, the cave house in the basement of its hangar church, and the meal at a long table, where the light from arched windows was white on the absolute. Each dish, a basket of pita, long-leaved lettuce, pastel swirls of hummus and tahini, clear as a still life. What a beautiful. Thank you, Fiona.
thank you so much. And thank you so much for your generosity. Yeah, just lovely to be read by you. And especially because I know your poems so well. It's a real joy.
I'm so grateful, so grateful.
Thank you very much, Smitha. And I'm sure Fiona must have enjoyed that reading, the way her poems took shape in and through you. And from Smitha, we move over to Tansy. We are very fortunate that I have already had a glimpse of Tansy reading a few poems. She had recorded, very sincere as she is, she had recorded some videos for us in case, the network on the train did not allow her to join. And they're lovely videos. I think I will email them to Fiona so that, Fiona can keep them treasured for a lifetime. So I'll just briefly introduce Tansy. Tansy Troy has lived and worked in India as an educator and performer, writer and poet for the past 7 years, though her connection with India stretches back to her childhood when she spent many moons traveling the subcontinent with her mother in search of rare handloom textiles. Her first poetry collection, Ratna Kosha, has recently been published with Red River and explores the notions of memory, home, and dwelling, and how love and friendship contribute to forming these vital bonds. We celebrated Tansy's book a few days ago, and we are very, very grateful we have had the opportunity to host her again. So over to you, Tansy, and special thanks for joining us from a very inconvenient position.
Thank you, Tansy.
So much. Thank you, Fiona. Thank you, Vasudha. So, yeah, I really hope the connection is okay. Please do let me know if the audio is not good enough, and I'll try it with headphones and see if that makes a difference.
Audio, video, everything is fine.
Great. So we've already had the ticket collector, the seller of the Bhagavad Gita, the man with the sheets, and the little carrot. But we're going to hopefully just have the door locked for the next part of the journey so nobody interrupts, because I want to give full and undivided attention to this beautiful book. As you said, Fiona, it is a fabulous production. I just love the fact that there are wonderful breathing spaces with the illustrations. The font is gorgeous. The layout is really, really, really nice. So, you know, already before we even begin to read, we have this wonderful Red River edition in our lucky hands. And this evening have really made a lot more sense of my reading of this beautiful collection. So I particularly loved you saying how you enjoy this kind of nectared quality of a poem. That's absolutely resonant, and it does. The poem seep like honey through the pages. So I really picked up on that, and the fact that you also say this amazing thing about the poem being a score for sound, a score for a musical score for the sound of the words. I've heard quite a lot of very eminent Indian poets talking about how important the sound rather than necessarily the exact form of the poem is, very recently this year, and so that too resonates quite strongly, because I think I'm right in saying, and please everybody from the Indian tradition correct me if you think I'm speaking out of turn here, but I feel that in India, and probably in Ireland as well, there is a lot of connection between song and poetry, and the poem is just the lyrics without the music, but it is in itself a very musical thing. So I felt when I was reading today and last week, I felt that I was reading lots of songs, hymns, and, you know, kind of chanson really, and this is really, I kind of wonder, in India, to read these in India, it gave me a real sense of longing for home and a kind of nostalgia for home. I haven't been back to England for a very long time, so all of these qualities are coming through to me, and I also found it very interesting about being in some sort of isolation as a poet in the British scene. Like, I am so far away from it geographically that I have no idea what is fashionable anymore. But I do feel that what connected to me was that I lived very remotely in Wales for quite a long time when I lived in the UK. And there was this sense of spaciousness and isolation in the location, in the locality. So I feel a spaciousness in your poetry. I felt that as I've read, I felt there's this kind of beauty that can emerge when one is very solitary sometimes, and when there's a sort of solitude, beautiful solitude, that one can often find in the British countryside or out of towns. In India, it's very different. Are you okay? Can you hear me?
Tansy, where did you live in Wales? Tansy, where did you live in Wales?
Near Brecon, near the Brecon Beacons. Oh, right. So in a village, very remote village, very, very remote village.
I'm near the Brecon Beacons now. So that's my part of the world. So yeah.
Interesting. Yeah. Well, there was definitely things that reminded me a lot about Wales, and I'll read one in a moment that particularly reminded me of my house there. But yeah, I guess that in India, we have to travel quite far up to the mountains to be this isolated and this solitary. So a lot of energy and that surrounds poetry and the making of poetry in India, which I particularly love. But it's very different to my experience of writing in the UK. So these things kind of came about, and also as you've been talking about the language of your childhood, I find this quite fascinating as an educator of young people. What really impacts us linguistically as children. As I read, I found these words were just flying off the page to me. Things like doxology, virgin, blue, milkiness, honey, candles, of prayer, heaven, light, dark wings, miracle, Christ, white. You know, these were very religious, but in a not necessarily biblical. And when in connection with all the wonderful natural phenomena that you detail, to something more than religion, which I love. You know, it's as if the spirit of nature is coming through. Of beautifulness is coming through these words. So I would like to start off by reading the Stone House poem, which reminded me very much of my home in Wales. It also reminded me of Yeats's Stone Cottage, Yeats and Pounds's Stone Cottage, and how sometimes we just need that warm wall to put our hand onto, where the sun has warmed it all day, and we just need to have that reassurance of warmed stone in order to feel very secure and earthed. So I loved the atmosphere surrounding this one. So let me read it for you all. Stone House. Really, what I want is to return again and again to a source that's inexhaustible and daily, but not ever water which is labile and cold, and I don't trust seeing the glitter fall apart in my hand, feeling my hand grow cold. I mean a wall, warm with the sun, thick with it like shelter, a wall thickly curved and made by hands whose gestures I could make in turning to a wall, its orange flank glowing in the late light, behind nettles and under elder trees. The source is love, of course, but huge and abstract. This too a house, whose roofless rooms become part of the wood, whose fire is choked with brambles and with wild apple, white anemones, those lucky stars pouring through doors and windows, and through the wall. So this kind of beautiful amorphous home, which is part nature and part earth, and I felt very at home there in that one. And also I wanted to, well, I don't know, maybe you can just tell us a little bit about your stone house and where it is, so we can visit one day.
My stone house is now in Herefordshire, within Beacons, but I grew up partly in Wales. And this stone house was actually a ruined stone house in Slovenia that made me realise what I wanted to do, which was live in a stone house.
Wow, fantastic. Well, I'm really glad that I chose that one because it felt very very important. And another one that I love is The Bee Summer. Before I read it, could you just first of all tell me if I'm pronouncing summer correct? Secondly, is it soma? Is it like soma, like the nectar of the bees? Or I wasn't quite sure if I...
No, it's I mean, I don't know how to pronounce it myself, really, but it's an Islamic form, because this was a set of bee poems, and I was thinking about that kind of Arabic tradition of calligraphy, but actually I was thinking about tiles and so on, which is non-representational, but is very closely related to natural forms.
Nice. Yeah, actually, what sprang to mind when I read this one was the wonderful Sufi shrine of Nizamuddin in Delhi. So as I was reading this, it was bringing back images and kind of scents and aromas of that particular wonderful space, and also about how those spaces, though formed architecturally, are transcendent in their way, even though they're very much built of beautiful design and wonderful materials. They are actually beyond that. So I love this. The summer. If God were limitless geometry, the perfection world reaches clumsily over itself to articulate. It's in the pattern of limitless addition. But when not that pattern, beautiful though the turquoises and greens of the glazed tiles are, so beautiful that the eye swoons, drooping through endless form. If God were neither principle nor aim, resting his cheek on earth for a moment, you might have imagined a gift of pure grace from a perfection that is bodiless, here and everywhere. Bees could be his servants and prophets, demonstrating beauty is a kind of humility. Tonight, they offer no more than the hive's aroma. So particularly feeling that the natural world could be prophets as well. This is so beautiful and very close to my heart, the feeling that we don't necessarily, just with our gift of language, know how much the animals and beautiful birds of our realm do understand or translate or know. Have I got time for one more, Basudra? I'd love to read Heron.
Yes, please.
Thank you so much. So Heron reminded me a lot of the bird poems that I've been trying very hard to depict in Haryana, in Rohtak, where I work in a school, and there are many beautiful birds, migratory and resident, who come and who fly over our campus and who nest on our campus. And heron was one that really struck me and reminded me a little bit of my red-wattled lapwings, Basudra, that I think I read at the last round the Hearth. So heron is another of those connections, I guess, between those interspecies, multi-species connections between humans and birds. Heron, alive, and yes, long wings beat, knock it out of the sky, silver out of lead. The ground darkens, but the moon is high over the trees. Black piercing black, white racing through black, heavy wings bent like strained back bows with feathers, tendons, bones, rise and rhythmic give as if light splayed its feathers and dived the white river. Or the heron rose continually, pulling with it dark water, hauling itself through the air, dragging along something not yet formed, the taste of dusk going green. Out of the formless full valley, the white fields and black copses, out of memory, out of the wood smells, the path and the dog ferreting under the hawthorn hedges, the heron bringing up another walk in a rainstorm here 10 years ago. Picture it skating over the dark trees, smooth as a moon. And the bird and I are still living. Thank you so much for these wonderful works. Really lovely.
Thank you so much, Tansy, for all your care and attention and for your very, very inhabited reading. Lovely to hear. Thank you.
Thank you, Tansy. That was wonderful reading of Fiona's poems, and you brought in so much energy and beauty to them from the train compartment that you are in. And we're very grateful, that you could make it to this. Thank you so much. And with this, we come to the close of a very, very beautiful session. And I would have liked to read Fiona's poem, Frankenstein's Golem, which I loved very much. But I don't know whether I have time. I don't know as moderator whether I have time.
You have time, Ambassador.
Right.
And
So I
before
just-
you do, can I thank you enormously for your super intelligent sharing? But can I thank also Tuhin? Sean had to go, I know. I mean, a huge thanks to Tansy and Smitha for your beautiful readings. Obviously, my profound thanks to Dibia for the book itself. I mean, I'm really, really grateful and delighted. And I'd love to hear you read Frankenstein's Golem if it's not selfish of me. Thank you, Ambassador.
Yes, I'm really grateful that Tuhin, Smitha, Tansy, Sean, everybody could make it. And of course to Dibya, who proposed the entire session. So I love Frankenstein's Golem. I love Frankenstein's Golem because it reminds me of Tithonus. It reminds me of Frankenstein, of course. And it also reminds me in a way of Prometheus. So there are so many heroes that are, in the subtext of this poem. And I love how it expresses so much in so little. Who's this moving swiftly through darkness in a landscape not yet given form by daylight, slipping shapeless as a shadow through the dark and unknown places, wearing night next to his skin, wearing a pelt of pine and stone? Who is this, atom seeding on his skin, who passes through the dark where he was buried and from which he was lifted? Not by love, by power alone, lifted from death and forced to pass again through his own dying. Who slips away between rocks as waterfalls electrify the dark? Who is this on the mountain where mornings break on the rocks, orange, pink, terracotta light, new and tenderly wrought? I love that poem very much. The last line, the wrought reminds me of the Grecian urn. And as I said, who is this? And the dark and the light reminds me of Tennyson's Tithonus. And the entire, the overshadowing figure here is Prometheus to me. So many heroes, fusing in this one. And I think this is a very spiritual reading of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. It does justice to the original text. So thank you. And this has been a very, very beautiful evening. We have had so many beautiful poems being read. We had Tuhin's very close reading of Days, and we had Sean's excellent commentary on the collection and on Fiona's art as a whole. I'm very, very grateful that the book is out in the world. The School on the Coast Road has miles and miles to travel. And thank you very much, everyone, for consenting for this evening session. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, everybody. Thank you, Ambassador.
Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Have a good night. Bye-bye.